powerful bow, double the power of many ordinary bows, up to 350 pounds of draw strength. But even this enhanced super crossbow cannot penetrate the armor. Today, the crossbow does not seem as deadly as the gun, but in the Middle Ages, it was considered so lethal that in 1139, Pope Innocent II banned its use.
Well, the armour seems to have performed quite well here. The crossbow has dented the armour, but the dents are not very deep and really unlikely to have done anything more than give the wearer a fright. There's also no sign of any cracking there, so this armour seems to perform very well against the crossbow.
But how will the armour stand up to the gun? The team is resetting the laboratory for the musket, which will be mounted in a clamp and fired remotely.
We've got in front of us here today a matchlock musket from the first quarter of the 17th century, still in use up until roughly the 1640s, 1650s. It's called a matchlock because it's ignited by a piece of glowing match cord in the serpent here, touching loose powder in the pan, causing chemical reaction in the barrel, and then we get the projectile coming out of the end.
The team will fire a 20-bore iron musket ball out of the 42-inch barrel using 2 grams of gunpowder, the same measure of powder used by musketeers in the Civil War. With this amount of gunpowder, the musket has less kick than a modern gun. It could easily be fired from the shoulder. Nevertheless, the muzzle velocity, in other words, the speed of the musket ball leaving the gun, was 1,400 feet per second. Although deadly if you were hit at close quarters, the musket was not accurate, and its effective range was little more than 100 feet. So the prevailing battle tactic was for ranks of musketeers to fire their volleys all at once, and create a wall of projectiles flying towards the enemy, rather than individual soldiers singling out specific targets. This meant that whether or not an individual musket was accurate didn't matter, as hundreds of balls would have sprayed the oncoming forces with the same effect as a machine gun. The inaccuracy of the musket was overcome in an ingenious way in the battle for Nagashino Castle in Japan in 1575. The musketeers were vastly outnumbered by a superior force of heavy infantry and cavalry. The commanders ordered the front ranks of musketeers to carry 3 guns each, so they could let off all 3 in rapid succession. 3,000 balls, 200 pounds of fast-moving lead, spraying out in less than a minute, devastated the enemy forces, and the battle was won. However, the warriors at Nagashino Castle did not have triplex armor. If they had...
The ball hit the target and it took away 1 layer of the metal and pushed the other 2 layers into the body. Now that gave us quite a big bash, quite a hole, but it didn't penetrate. We've still got 2 layers of steel that have withstood the charge.
The massacre at Nagashino would have been prevented had they had English Civil War triplex armor.
Well, this is very similar to the way a modern armour would work, particularly a ceramic-faced composite armour, where it would use a ceramic layer on the front to spread the bullet out and disrupt it, and then a composite layer on the back to absorb the energy of the projectile, so stopping full penetration occurring.
Our experiment has shown that the use of multiple layers of metal armour is capable of resisting projectiles. The breastplate was an innovative, lightweight alternative to thicker and heavier single-layer armour.
One thing that triplex armour does prove is that armourers were constantly striving to upgrade their product to make the wearer a lot safer. And this actually shows that by using 3 layers of steel, it is possible to slow down or even in some cases stop musket balls or pistol balls.
Over 350 years later, the same principle underlies the latest developments in tank armour.
Weapons on impact will penetrate the initial layer, but then they'll explode into the air gap, rather than penetrating through the internal armour and killing the occupants.
However, advances in armour construction could not counter the threat of every new type of missile. Ancient Discoveries investigates a rocket-based weapons system that would not look out of place on today's battlefield. The ancient world's answer to the modern anti-tank missile. In the 3rd century BC, Alexander the Great conquered almost all the known world. Turkey, Syria, Judea, Egypt and Mesopotamia had all fallen to the most celebrated commander, perhaps of all time. But in 326 BC, he came face to face with a new threat, the ancient tank.
When Alexander's conquest runs across into India, he comes across the kingdom of Porus, and he meets elephants in battle for the first time.
The Hydaspes River in the present-day Punjab region of India was the battleground. On one side stood 45,000 battle-hardened troops led by Alexander. On the other was King Porus and 50,000 Indian infantry, supported by 200 war elephants.
Even the best soldiers will be spooked by something as novel, as bizarre and as awe-inspiring as the first tanks or war elephants.
So how do you defeat the ancient tank? The Shahnameh, a manuscript written in the 11th century by the Persian poet Ferdowsi, suggests that Alexander used an extraordinary weapons system.
There's a wonderful Farsi poem which says that Alexander the Great defeated Porus's war elephants by building large numbers of iron horses, which he filled with naphtha and then set on fire.
However, other sources report that it was Alexander's tactical brilliance and the heroism of his soldiers that won the day, not the burning of iron statues.
He wins the battle, and the elephants then come back into post-Alexander Hellenistic warfare.
Alexander had achieved what all commanders demand of their anti-tank weapons: to disable the weaponry, pierce the armor, or bring the whole attack to a complete halt.
The ability to take out the enemy's main firepower has always been paramount to winning the battle. If the enemy doesn't have his mobile firepower in his tanks or his elephants, he hasn't got the backup for his infantry on the ground. Therefore, you have a higher chance of winning the battle.
But Alexander's victory came at a high cost. The 12,000 casualties he incurred from Porus's war elephants left his forces unable or unwilling to fight on in order to complete their invasion of India. But a precedent had been set. War elephants could be defeated.
Elephants are unusual creatures, really, to use in battle. They don't like the atmosphere of the battlefield. They don't like the screams. They don't like the smell and the sound of death. And quite often these creatures would turn tail and, of course, actually storm straight through their own ranks rather than the enemy ranks, causing absolute chaos.
Military commanders soon began to deploy many kinds of anti-elephant devices that targeted the animal's vulnerabilities.
One particularly ingenious way the ancients came up with of panicking elephants was to coat pigs in tar and set fire to them. Elephants, unsurprisingly, get very frightened by self-barbecuing pigs heading their way.
These poor, kind of flaming porcine creatures would charge towards the elephants and send them off in a crazy stampede.
But 1,000 years after Alexander's incursion into the Punjab, India was still the center of ancient tank technology. The Mughal Emperor Akbar, in his campaign to extend into Gujarat in northern India, was faced with the same problem as Alexander. But now the world had gunpowder.
There's a battle between the Mughals and the army of Gujarat. The Mughals have quite a small army, and they're using a lot of missile weapons, artillery and rockets. And the Gujaratis are relying more on older technologies, the elephant in particular.
During Akbar's campaigns, countless rockets were launched by hand or mounted in wooden frames and set off. The weapons system was even said to target elephants specifically by skimming the rockets just above the ground.
In this battle, a rocket hits one of the elephants, and the inevitable happens. He stampedes, the other elephants stampede. A very large Gujarati army is defeated by a much smaller Mughal army using firepower and knocking out their primary weapon system. And this is the battle where the elephant really ends his reign on the battlefield.
The weapon that ended 2 millennia of the elephant's dominion over the battlefield was not much bigger than a large mouse. Rocket experts Ben Jarvis and Paul Birch are investigating how such a weapons system could have been deployed by Akbar's rocket artillery units.
From as early as the 13th century, rockets were being used by the military. It wasn't until the sort of 17th or 18th century that they had much more of a defined use. Rockets were generally used on the battlefield mainly as a psychological weapon, and were used for sort of scaring horses, camels and elephants.
The text describes the rockets as being 8 inches long and 1.5 to 3 inches in diameter. The canister of propellant was sealed at one end and strapped to a shaft of bamboo about 4 feet long.
This is basically a replica that we've built of one of the 17th century rockets. The casing here would have been made of iron, and it's bound onto a bamboo cane with this leather thong. The Indians were using iron-cased rockets probably before pretty much anyone else was. It has a lot of advantages over bamboo cases, for example, which the Chinese use, in that it's able to contain the explosive power of the gunpowder much, much better. So they could have packed more in and got higher pressure and therefore higher performance out of the rocket.
Ben and Paul have recreated a multiple rocket launcher.
We've basically got a rack of 8 replica Indian artillery rockets here, using gunpowder engines, same as the Indians would have done up until the 18th, 19th centuries.
Straw bales equal to the width and depth of 2 war elephants have been set up 120 yards away.
Using these sort of old bamboo canes and the same sort of technology that they would have used, accuracy isn't exactly guaranteed. So this is probably one of the reasons why they use quite so many rockets. Batteries of 8 or 10 would commonly have been used. On this test, we've got the angle we think about right. So we're hoping that these ones should be fairly accurate. We're aiming for a fairly straight flight.
How will the weapons system that ended the reign of the war elephant behave under test conditions? Seen here in 3D, the rocket's trajectories are wild and inaccurate, with no 2 missiles showing the same line of fire. But just as the ancient engineers must have found, testing the war elephant destroyer involves refining and endless retakes.
We're going to do another test of a single rocket this time. We've picked one that's got quite a straight stick. We've lowered the angle about another 5 degrees, so we're going to have another go, see if we can actually get it to hit the target.
Despite the team's recalculation of the angle the launcher should be set at, they're still finding it difficult to hit the target. Did the Indian rocket men know something that Ben and Paul have yet to find out?
The texts that we have about these Indian artillery rockets tell us that they were actually able to sort of hit targets with different diameter rockets and do calculations to work out what elevation. Having done all these tests today, if nothing else, it proves that they must have really known what they were doing, because it's proven a lot harder than I thought it was going to be to actually hit a target, even from fairly close range.
The team has now set the launcher at 12 degrees. They hope the straighter line from launch to target will give better results. While lowering the degree of the angle of fire has brought improved performance, 3 rockets having kept a lower trajectory, replicating the feats of the ancient Indian rocketeers is proving a very tough assignment. After firing more than 25 rockets, the team has decided to move the weapons system closer in to a range of 80 feet. Firing at closer range finally brings success.
Well, we finally managed to actually hit the target. If nothing else, we've learned today that these rockets really probably were very, very inaccurate, and in terms of actually hitting a fixed, let alone a moving target, it would have been very, very hard for them. If you're firing hundreds of them at a time, it only takes one of them to go even near a horse or an elephant, and the effect would have been devastating.
At this close range, the terrified Indian soldiers would have had to wait until the elephants were almost upon them before firing. Just like today, tank battles then were fought with technology, but won by the bravery of men.
I think there are brief moments when the elephant is the tank of the ancient and medieval world, but they're very brief because the innovative thinking of people like Alexander the Great, the Mughal emperors like Akbar, they very quickly realize that they have to neutralize this advantage which the enemy has, and they do so.
From fierce